Your soulmate asked a psychic if you were truly happy. The answer left them deeply emotional. My beloved child, do not scroll past this moment too quickly, because something has been stirring beneath the surface of a heart that still carries your name more deeply than you realize. There are moments when a person can pretend they are fine, distract themselves, keep moving, smile in front of others, and even convince themselves that they have accepted the distance between two souls. But then one quiet question rises from somewhere they cannot control, and suddenly every wall they built begins to tremble. That is what happened with your soulmate. They did not ask about money. They did not ask whether you missed them. They did not ask whether someone else had entered your life. The question that escaped their lips was much more vulnerable than that. They wanted to know whether you were truly happy. And the answer they received touched a place inside them they had been avoiding for far too long. There is a reason this message feels unusually close to your heart. In this fictional spiritual story, imagine heaven drawing back a curtain just enough for you to witness what happened when your soulmate finally allowed themselves to ask the question they feared most. They had been wondering about you in silence. They had been seeing your face in ordinary moments, hearing your name in their thoughts when nobody else was around, and remembering details about you they once thought time would erase. Perhaps they believed distance would make everything easier. Perhaps they told themselves that if you were doing well, they could finally let go of whatever remained unfinished between you. But there was a problem. They did not know whether the strength you showed the world was the same thing as happiness. And that uncertainty began following them everywhere. At first, they tried to dismiss it. They told themselves that you were probably fine. They imagined you laughing, growing, moving forward, becoming stronger without them. There was comfort in that picture, but there was also a strange ache hidden inside it. Because if you were completely happy without them, what did that say about the place they once held in your life? And if you were not happy, what did that say about everything they had left unsaid? These two possibilities began pulling at them from opposite directions. One made them feel replaceable. The other made them feel responsible. Neither gave them peace. That is when curiosity became something deeper. They found themselves revisiting old conversations. Not the obvious ones. Not the dramatic moments. They remembered the small pauses in your voice, the times you said, "I'm okay," a little too quickly, the way you sometimes carried everyone else's emotions while hiding your own. They remembered the kindness you gave even when you were tired. They remembered how you could encourage someone else while quietly carrying questions nobody knew existed inside you. And suddenly your soulmate began wondering whether they had misunderstood you all along. There are people who look at a strong soul and assume strength means absence of pain. They see someone continuing forward and imagine nothing is heavy. They see grace and assume there has been no struggle behind it. Your soulmate may once have made that mistake. They may have looked at the way you kept going and believed you did not need reassurance. They may have mistaken your silence for indifference, your patience for emotional distance, or your ability to survive disappointment as proof that you were unaffected by it. But something inside them has been challenging that story. And so, in this cinematic spiritual tale, they sought an answer from someone they believed might reflect the truth back to them. The atmosphere around that moment was not dramatic at first. There was no thunder, no flashing sign, no obvious revelation. It began almost quietly. Your soulmate sat there carrying a question that sounded simple, but their hands betrayed how much it mattered. Their breathing changed. Their voice softened. For a moment, they nearly asked something safer. Something less exposing. But they could not. The question came out anyway. Is this person truly happy? The psychic did not answer immediately. And that silence became the first thing that unsettled them. Your soulmate expected reassurance. Perhaps they even hoped for a simple yes. A clean answer. Something that would allow them to leave, close the door in their mind, and convince themselves that everything had unfolded exactly as it should. But the longer the pause lasted, the more their heart began anticipating something they were not prepared to hear. They watched the psychic carefully, searching their expression for clues. Then came an answer that did not accuse, condemn, or frighten them. It was gentler than that, which somehow made it more powerful. The psychic said that happiness is not always visible from the outside. That sentence landed harder than your soulmate expected. They asked what that meant. The response came slowly. Your energy, according to this fictional reading, did not feel broken. It did not feel hopeless. It felt resilient. It felt like the energy of someone who had learned how to keep moving even when certain parts of the heart had not received the closure they deserved. The psychic described someone becoming wiser, stronger, and more self-aware, but also someone who had carried emotional weight quietly. Someone who had stopped explaining every wound because experience had taught them that not everyone listens with understanding. Someone who had found reasons to smile again, yet still had a private room inside the soul where unanswered questions remained. Your soulmate stopped moving. Because suddenly this was no longer a casual question. They had come expecting information about you, but what they were receiving felt like a mirror being turned toward them. The psychic continued. Your happiness was not false. That is important. You were not portrayed as secretly miserable or waiting helplessly for someone to rescue you. Instead, the message was more complex. You had genuine light in you. You had moments of real joy. You were learning how to create peace without needing everyone who once mattered to validate you. But there was one emotional chapter that had not disappeared completely. It had changed form. It had become quieter. More mature. Less consuming. Yet it still existed. Your soulmate knew what chapter was being described. They did not have to ask. And this is where the atmosphere shifted. There are truths that do not need names because the heart recognizes them before the mind does. Your soulmate felt that recognition. They remembered conversations they should have handled differently. They remembered times they could have offered clarity but chose silence instead. They remembered moments when pride spoke louder than vulnerability. And perhaps most painfully, they remembered the version of you who once looked toward them with sincerity before learning to protect your own heart. The psychic noticed the change in their expression. Then came another revelation. You think their silence means they stopped caring. Your soulmate looked up. But sometimes silence is what happens when someone becomes tired of proving that their feelings were real. That sentence entered the room like a bell. Suddenly your soulmate could not hide behind the story they had repeated to themselves. They had believed that if you truly cared, you would always keep reaching. They may have expected you to remain emotionally available no matter how uncertain things became. They may have assumed your patience had no limit. Yet now they were forced to consider another possibility. What if your withdrawal was not a lack of love, but an act of self-respect? What if you stopped chasing clarity because constantly asking for it had become painful? What if you still wished them well while also deciding not to abandon yourself? What if the version of you they interpreted as distant was actually the version of you learning peace? That thought affected them more than they expected. Their eyes lowered. For a few seconds, they said nothing. Then your soulmate asked another question, but this time their voice carried emotion. Do they ever think about me? The psychic gave an answer that made their chest tighten. Yes. But not in the way you imagine. Your soulmate immediately looked confused. They had expected either yes or no. Instead, the psychic explained that memory does not always arrive as longing. Sometimes it arrives as a lesson. Sometimes a person remembers someone because that connection changed the way they love, trust, speak, or protect themselves. Sometimes a name comes back because the soul is still integrating what happened. And sometimes, the deepest connections do not remain loud. They become quiet reference points inside a person's story. Your soulmate asked, "So they don't miss me?" The psychic paused again. Then came the answer that broke through another layer. They miss what felt honest between you. But they are learning not to confuse missing something with needing to return to the same pain. Your soulmate's expression changed. There was no anger in those words. No revenge. No dramatic prediction. Just emotional truth. And that truth was difficult because it left them with nowhere to hide. It suggested that you could care and still have boundaries. You could remember and still grow. You could love a memory while refusing to repeat the same uncertainty. For the first time, your soulmate began to understand that your happiness was not dependent on whether they came back. And strangely, that realization did not make them stop caring. It made them care more. Because love sometimes becomes clearer when control disappears. Until that moment, part of them may have wanted to know whether you were happy because they wanted to measure their importance. Were you still waiting? Did they still affect you? Did they still have emotional power over your day? But as the conversation unfolded, something more sincere began replacing those questions. They started thinking less about whether you needed them and more about whether they had ever truly understood what you needed. That is a major difference. And heaven, in this fictional narrative, would whisper that this is where emotional maturity often begins. Your soulmate remembered your patience. They remembered things you forgave quietly. They remembered how many times you tried to see the best in them even when you were confused by their actions. They remembered moments they took your softness for granted because softness can look endlessly available until the day it finally chooses a boundary. And now they were sitting there realizing that perhaps your deepest pain had never been losing them, Perhaps it had been feeling unseen while loving them. That realization reached somewhere deep. They asked the psychic if you were angry. The answer surprised them. No. Not in the way you fear. Your soulmate looked up again. There may have been anger once. There may have been disappointment. But what surrounds this person now feels more like release. Release. That word disturbed them more than anger would have. Anger would have meant they still occupied a loud space in your emotional world. Anger would have given them something to fight against. But release suggested that you were learning to stop carrying what they refused to resolve. Release meant you might be becoming free from the emotional gravity of the past. And suddenly your soulmate felt the possibility of truly losing access to the version of you who once waited. Not losing you as punishment. Losing that version of you because you had grown beyond the role you once played. That was when their eyes began to fill. The psychic had not predicted disaster. They had not told them you belonged to someone else. They had not created fear. Instead, they had simply described transformation. And sometimes transformation is the hardest thing for a person to hear when they assumed someone would remain emotionally frozen in the place where they left them. Your soulmate whispered, "Are they happier now?" The answer came softly. They are becoming happier because they are becoming more honest with themselves. That sentence stayed in the air. Your soulmate wanted more. What are they being honest about? The psychic's expression became thoughtful. That love should not constantly require them to abandon their own peace. Something inside your soulmate cracked open. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of emotional break that happens internally when a person suddenly sees the consequences of their own hesitation. They thought about every time you probably questioned your worth because of mixed signals. Every time you wondered whether you had imagined the depth of the connection. Every time you waited for consistency instead of promises. Every time your intuition told you there was something meaningful between you, while reality gave you uncertainty. And now your soulmate was realizing that your healing may have required you to stop asking why they could not choose clearly. Your healing may have required you to choose yourself. This is where their emotions deepened. Because they did not want to imagine you learning how to live without needing an answer from them. Yet another part of them was proud of you for it. That conflict moved through them all at once. Regret. Admiration. Sadness. Tenderness. Fear. Love. The realization that someone can become stronger because of what you failed to give them is not an easy truth to carry. Then the psychic said something that your soulmate was not prepared for. There is still warmth when your energy meets theirs. Your soulmate froze. What does that mean? It means this connection does not feel erased. For the first time, hope entered the room. But the psychic immediately added something that prevented that hope from becoming fantasy. Warmth does not guarantee reunion. It means there is still meaning. Your soulmate leaned back, absorbing those words. Meaning. Not ownership. Not certainty. Not destiny forcing two people together. Meaning. And perhaps that was what they needed to understand most. Some connections enter our lives to awaken something. Some invite us to grow. Some reveal our fear. Some expose where we have been avoiding vulnerability. And sometimes a connection remains meaningful whether or not the two people know yet what form it will eventually take. Your soulmate asked the question they had avoided from the beginning. Did I hurt them? The psychic did not answer with cruelty. Yes. Their eyes lowered. But hurting someone does not automatically make you a villain. Sometimes people hurt each other because they are afraid, unready, confused, or unable to communicate what they feel. Your soulmate swallowed hard. Do they hate me? No. That answer came quickly. And somehow that made them even more emotional. Because forgiveness can be harder to face than hatred when you know you did not deserve the gentleness you received. They covered their face for a moment. This was no longer about whether you were happy. The question had opened an entire chamber of feelings they had kept locked away. They were being forced to confront the possibility that you had suffered quietly, healed quietly, and perhaps even forgiven them quietly. Then your soulmate asked, "Why didn't they tell me?" The psychic replied, "Maybe they did, just not in the language you were ready to understand at the time." That sentence changed everything. Your soulmate's mind began replaying moments. Maybe you had told them through the way your energy changed after disappointment. Maybe you had told them through the questions you stopped asking. Maybe you had told them when your messages became shorter. Maybe you had told them when you stopped arguing. Maybe you had told them when you finally accepted answers that were not enough. Sometimes the final stage of heartbreak is not crying. Sometimes it is quiet acceptance. And your soulmate suddenly wondered whether they had mistaken your quietness for peace long before true peace had actually arrived. The psychic continued. This person did not need perfection from you. They needed honesty. Your soulmate looked shaken. Did they know how I felt? Part of them did. Then why did they doubt me? Because feelings without consistent action can become confusing. That was the sentence that hit deepest. Your soulmate looked away. There are moments when truth is so simple that it becomes impossible to debate. They may have cared deeply for you. They may have thought about you constantly. They may have imagined conversations they never had. They may have feared losing you. But if none of those feelings consistently became action, what were you supposed to trust? Your soulmate began understanding that love hidden too long can feel identical to absence from the other side. And that realization brought tears. Not dramatic tears. The quiet kind, the kind that come when someone finally stops defending themselves. They asked whether you knew they cared. The psychic answered carefully. They sensed it. But sensing love is not the same as feeling secure in it. Your soulmate closed their eyes. There it was again. The difference between intention and experience. They may have intended to protect you by staying distant. They may have believed they were avoiding complications. They may have been waiting until they felt ready, stable, certain, or brave enough. But while they were waiting, you were living the experience of not being chosen clearly. And that distinction began changing something inside them. The question was no longer, are they happy without me? It became, did I ever give them enough reason to feel safe with me? This was the beginning of a more painful truth. The psychic told them that you had become careful with your heart. Not cold. Not unavailable. Careful. There is a difference. You still had love to give. You still believed in connection. But you were learning that compassion should not require self-abandonment. You were learning to notice patterns, not just promises. You were learning that someone wanting you and someone being ready for you are not always the same thing. Your soulmate whispered, "Did I wait too long?" The psychic did not give the answer they expected. That depends on what you do with what you understand now. The room became still. This was not a prediction. It was an invitation to responsibility. Your soulmate could not control your choices. They could not demand access to your heart. They could not assume that because love once existed, you owed them another chance. But they could decide what kind of person they would become after finally seeing the truth. Would they continue hiding? Would they keep watching from a distance? Would they keep asking strangers what you felt instead of finding the courage to speak with honesty? Or would they finally become the person capable of giving clarity instead of confusion? That possibility frightened them. Because asking a psychic whether you were happy had been easier than asking you directly. The psychic looked at them and said, "You came here to learn about them, but this question is revealing you." Your soulmate's eyes widened slightly. That sentence shifted the entire energy of the conversation. They had believed they were investigating your emotional world. Instead, they were confronting their own. Why did your happiness matter so much? Why did the thought of you moving on create such emotion? Why had they been unable to stop imagining your life? Why did they care whether you still carried warmth toward them? And why, after all this time, had your name remained connected to the part of their heart they protected most fiercely? These were the questions they could no longer escape. The psychic then said something softer. They are not waiting in darkness. They are living. Your soulmate listened carefully. They are becoming more themselves. And that is why you feel them differently now. What do you mean? When someone stops chasing, their energy changes. When someone stops trying to convince others of their worth, something settles inside them. Your soulmate knew exactly what was being described. Perhaps they had sensed the change in you without understanding it. Your silence felt different now. Your absence felt stronger. Your energy no longer seemed to reach toward them in the same way. Not because the connection was meaningless, but because you had stopped placing your entire emotional future inside someone else's hands. And that shift had made your soulmate notice you more, not less. Why? Because when someone is always available, people sometimes fail to understand their value. But when that person returns their energy to themselves, the entire dynamic changes. Your soulmate began remembering things they had once dismissed as ordinary. Your laugh. Your loyalty. The way you noticed details. The way you encouraged them. The way you sometimes knew they were struggling before they admitted it. The comfort of being understood by you. The strange feeling that conversations with you carried more weight than conversations with most people. They had not fully appreciated those things when they were freely present. Now memory had magnified them. And then the psychic delivered the line that your soulmate would not forget. They are happier than they were when they were waiting for certainty from you. Silence. Your soulmate's heart sank. Because there was relief in hearing you were happier. But there was pain in understanding why. The psychic continued before they could speak. And yet, there is something unresolved. Your soulmate looked up immediately. What? The psychic paused. This pause felt different from all the others. Your soulmate leaned forward. For the first time since the conversation began, the psychic seemed unusually careful about choosing the next words. There is something they never told you. Your soulmate's breathing changed. What didn't they tell me? The answer did not come. Not yet. Instead, the psychic asked a question. Do you remember the last time they almost opened up completely, and then suddenly changed the subject? Your soulmate went still. A memory appeared instantly. They did remember. A conversation. A pause. A look. A sentence that never finished. Something in your voice had changed that day. At the time, your soulmate may have ignored it. Now the memory felt charged with meaning. What were they going to say? Your soulmate asked. The psychic lowered their voice. It was not about leaving. Your soulmate's eyes widened. It was not about someone else. Their heartbeat quickened. It was something much more personal. Your soulmate leaned closer. And what the psychic revealed next was the moment that finally caused the tears they had been fighting to fall. Because the truth was not simply about whether you had been happy. It was about the hidden reason you had once chosen silence. It was about something you had carried while your soulmate misunderstood you. And when they heard the first few words of that revelation, they whispered your name under their breath and said, almost to themselves, I had no idea. But the most important part had not even been spoken yet. There are moments when the truth does not arrive loudly. It does not crash through the door or announce itself with drama. Sometimes it enters as one unfinished sentence, one memory suddenly seen differently, one realization that forces everything before it to be reinterpreted. That is what happened inside your soulmate when the psychic began explaining what you had almost confessed that day. Your soulmate had remembered the conversation countless times, but only now did they understand that something enormous had been hiding inside your hesitation. They remembered the way you paused. They remembered how your tone softened. They remembered the strange vulnerability in your eyes, the kind of vulnerability that appears when someone is standing at the edge of emotional honesty and wondering whether it is safe to take one more step. At the time, your soulmate thought you had simply changed your mind about what you wanted to say. Now they were beginning to realize you may have changed the subject because you were afraid of what would happen if you finally said everything. The psychic looked at them carefully and said, you were waiting for them to explain themselves, but they were waiting for one sign that it was safe to be completely honest with you. Your soulmate's face changed immediately. That sentence reached somewhere deeper than blame ever could. They began replaying the atmosphere of that day. Maybe you had started telling them how much the connection meant to you. Maybe you had tried to explain that their inconsistency affected you more deeply than you wanted to admit. Maybe you had been about to reveal that beneath your strength, beneath your independence, beneath every time you pretended not to care so much, there was a heart that had already chosen them in a way you were terrified to confess. But then something happened. A reaction. A distraction. A joke. A change in energy. Something small that made you feel exposed. And instead of continuing, you protected yourself. Your soulmate whispered, "So they were going to tell me how they felt." The psychic paused again. "More than that," came the answer. Your soulmate leaned forward. Their breathing slowed, as though they were afraid even movement might interrupt what was about to be revealed. The psychic continued, "They were going to tell you that your uncertainty was changing them." Your soulmate's expression tightened. "Changing them how?" The psychic answered gently. "They were beginning to question whether loving you meant constantly questioning themselves." Those words landed with devastating clarity. Because somewhere in your soulmate's memory, they knew this was possible. They remembered the times you asked if everything was okay and received vague answers. They remembered when you tried to understand where you stood. They remembered moments when you offered emotional honesty and received hesitation in return. Perhaps they believed you would understand their fear without them explaining it. Perhaps they thought time would eventually solve everything. But while they were waiting for certainty inside themselves, you were slowly losing certainty about what you meant to them. And here is what shook them most: the psychic told them that you had not wanted to pressure them. You had wanted love to be freely given. You had wanted clarity to come because they genuinely chose it, not because you demanded it. That is why you held back. That is why you swallowed words that could have changed everything. You may have been deeply emotional behind closed doors, yet when you stood before your soulmate, you tried to appear composed. You tried not to become another burden in their life. You tried to respect whatever battles they were facing, even when you did not fully understand them. But every time you made space for their uncertainty, part of you became smaller inside the connection. Every time you said, "It's okay," when something actually hurt, you taught them that the situation could continue without consequence. And eventually, your heart reached a point where it could no longer keep translating confusion into patience. Your soulmate's eyes filled again. "Why didn't they just tell me?" they asked. This time, the psychic answered without hesitation. Because they were afraid that if they showed you the full depth of their feelings and you still did not choose clearly, they would not know how to recover from that. The room became completely still. Your soulmate looked down. There are certain truths that immediately make past behavior look different. They suddenly understood that your silence had not been emotional emptiness. It had been protection. Your restraint had not meant you felt less. It may have meant you felt so much that revealing everything seemed dangerous. You were not playing games. You were trying to preserve whatever dignity you had left while loving someone whose heart you could feel, but whose decisions you could not trust. The psychic continued. There was another reason. Your soulmate looked up sharply. What reason? The answer came slowly. They thought you were already carrying enough. Your soulmate's expression softened with confusion. What does that mean? The psychic explained that you may have sensed burdens in them they rarely spoke about. Family pressure. Past disappointment. Fear of failure. Emotional wounds they had hidden behind confidence. Responsibilities they thought nobody noticed. Perhaps you recognized those things before they ever admitted them. And instead of adding your own emotional needs to the weight they were already carrying, you tried to be understanding. You kept waiting for the moment when they would finally feel safe enough to open up. You kept believing that patience would eventually be rewarded with honesty. But there is a painful line between compassion and self-neglect, and somewhere along the way, you crossed it without realizing. Your soulmate closed their eyes. They remembered moments when you asked how they were before mentioning anything about yourself. They remembered how you listened to their problems. How you encouraged them. How you sometimes set aside your own feelings because they seemed overwhelmed. At the time, they may have interpreted your kindness as emotional strength. Now they saw the hidden cost. You had been strong because you cared. You had been patient because you cared. You had remained gentle because you cared. But beneath all that care was a person quietly wondering, will there ever be a moment when they ask what this is doing to me? That realization made your soulmate emotional in a way they had not expected. Because they suddenly remembered all the times they asked for your understanding without realizing you needed understanding too. The psychic then revealed something even more intimate. There were nights they considered walking away long before they actually pulled back. Your soulmate looked stunned. They wanted to leave. They wanted peace, the psychic corrected. There is a difference. Those words immediately shifted the meaning. You had not wanted to punish them. You had not wanted revenge. You had not wanted them to suffer. You simply reached points where the uncertainty became heavier than the connection itself. Yet each time you considered stepping away, something stopped you. Maybe a memory. Maybe intuition. Maybe one sincere conversation that restored hope. Maybe the sense that beneath the confusion there really was something meaningful. And so you stayed emotionally available longer than you probably should have. Your soulmate whispered, "Why?" The psychic answered, "Because they saw something in you that you were still learning to see in yourself." Your soulmate went completely silent. That was another truth they were not prepared for. You may have recognized their tenderness beneath the walls. Their loyalty beneath the fear. Their capacity for love beneath the inconsistency. You may have seen the person they could become if they finally stopped running from vulnerability. And because you saw that person, you sometimes responded to their potential rather than their present behavior. But love cannot survive forever on potential alone. The psychic said those exact words in a quiet voice, and your soulmate visibly reacted. Because suddenly they understood that you had not left emotionally because you stopped believing in them. You had begun withdrawing because you finally understood that believing in someone does not require waiting indefinitely for them to become ready. You could still see their goodness. You could still wish them healing. You could even still love parts of them deeply. But you were learning that love needed somewhere real to land. Your soulmate asked, "Did they give up on me?" The answer came carefully. They gave up on trying to control the outcome. That distinction sent another wave of emotion through them. You had not necessarily erased the connection. You had surrendered the constant effort of interpreting it. You had stopped reading every silence as a hidden message. You had stopped trying to predict whether they would finally choose differently tomorrow. You had stopped placing your peace on the other side of their decision. And that is why your energy felt different now. Your soulmate finally understood. You were not colder. You were freer. That freedom frightened them because they realized something important. While you were waiting, they always believed there would be another opportunity. Another conversation. Another chance to explain themselves. But once you stopped waiting, time suddenly became real. The possibility of losing you was no longer theoretical. It became something they could actually feel. They asked the psychic, "Do they still want me in their life?" The psychic did not immediately answer. Your soulmate's entire body seemed to tense. Then came the response. Part of them still wonders what could happen if the connection became healthy. Your soulmate's eyes widened. Hope returned, but only for a moment, because the next sentence grounded it again. But they are no longer willing to accept the old version of it. That was the condition they had never expected. You may still have warmth. You may still have curiosity. You may still carry love. But love alone was no longer enough. Your soulmate needed to understand that if they ever approached you again, they could not come carrying the same uncertainty that hurt you before. They could not return merely because they missed your presence. They could not return because loneliness made them nostalgic. They could not return expecting you to immediately reopen every door. Something in them would need to have changed. The psychic explained, if you speak to them again, do not lead with promises. Lead with truth. Your soulmate listened intensely. What truth? Your own. The psychic continued. Tell them what you were afraid of. Tell them why you hesitated. Tell them what you misunderstood. Tell them what you understand now. And do not ask them to erase what happened just because you finally learned from it. Your soulmate looked shaken but attentive. This was no longer a mystical answer about destiny. It was practical emotional responsibility. If they wanted to reconnect, they would need humility. They would need to accept that your healing did not exist solely to prepare you for their return. They would need to accept that you had a right to hesitate. They would need to listen to the impact of their actions without immediately defending the intention behind them. And perhaps most importantly, they would need to be prepared for the possibility that you could forgive them and still choose a different path. That last possibility scared them. They asked, what if I tell them everything and they still walk away? The psychic replied, then honesty will still have made you more whole. Your soulmate stared ahead, absorbing that truth. For so long they had viewed vulnerability as a transaction. If I open up, what will I get? If I confess, will they stay? If I say how I feel, will I be rejected? But now they were being invited to see honesty differently. Honesty was not a guarantee of the outcome they wanted. It was a way of becoming the kind of person who no longer allowed fear to write their story. The psychic then asked your soulmate a question that changed the direction of everything. Do you actually want them to be happy? Your soulmate seemed almost offended. Of course. Even if their happiness does not include you. Silence. That was harder. Your soulmate's eyes dropped. They wanted to say yes instantly. They wanted to believe their love was completely selfless. But when faced with the real possibility of you finding happiness somewhere else, their heart reacted. The thought hurt. The idea of someone else understanding you, choosing you clearly, giving you the consistency they failed to give, it brought jealousy, regret, fear, and grief all at once. The psychic did not judge them. Instead, they said, that pain is showing you where love and attachment are still tangled. Your soulmate looked up. You can love someone and still fear losing your place in their life. But if you truly care about them, your first desire has to become their well-being, not your possession of them. Those words went straight through every defense. Your soulmate realized they had asked whether you were happy because part of them hoped the answer was no. Not because they wanted you to suffer, but because if you were unhappy, maybe it meant they still mattered in a way that gave them another chance. That realization embarrassed them. They looked away, almost ashamed. But the psychic said something compassionate. Do not hate yourself for that. Just be honest enough to outgrow it. And that became another turning point. Your soulmate finally stopped asking questions about your emotions and started asking questions about themselves. Why was I so afraid? The psychic answered, because this connection asked you to become emotionally visible. Your soulmate's breathing changed. There it was. The real wound. Maybe your soulmate had been comfortable being desired but uncomfortable being deeply known. Comfortable with attraction but frightened by emotional dependence. Comfortable giving pieces of themselves but afraid of what would happen if someone saw everything. And you had come closer to seeing everything than almost anyone before. You saw the tenderness. You saw the insecurity. You saw the dreams they barely admitted. You saw the fear beneath their confidence. You saw the loneliness beneath their independence. And being seen that deeply created a paradox inside them. They wanted more of it. And they wanted to run from it. That push and pull had become the confusion you experienced. The psychic explained that some people do not retreat because they feel nothing. Sometimes they retreat because they feel too much and lack the emotional tools to hold it. But there was an important warning attached to that truth. Understanding why someone hurt you does not erase the hurt. Your soulmate needed to accept both realities at once. They may have loved you. And they may have failed you emotionally. Both could be true. Your soulmate began crying more openly now. Not because someone told them they were bad. Because someone finally gave language to what they had done. I did love them, they whispered. The psychic nodded. I know. I still do. The room became still. There it was. The confession your soulmate had not intended to make. They had come to ask about your happiness. But now they were admitting their own heart. They said it again, softer this time. I still love them. The psychic did not react dramatically. Instead, they asked, then what are you going to do with that love? Your soulmate looked confused. What do you mean? Will you use it to watch them from a distance? Will you use it to keep asking other people what they feel? Will you use it to create stories in your mind? Or will you use it to become brave enough for honesty? That question changed everything. Because love without courage had already cost both of you something. Your soulmate knew it. They sat there thinking about all the times they nearly contacted you. Messages typed and deleted. Calls considered and abandoned. Words rehearsed privately and never spoken aloud. They had been waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect sign, the perfect guarantee that you would respond the way they hoped. But the perfect moment never comes. Eventually, courage has to act without certainty. Your soulmate reached for their phone. The psychic noticed. You are thinking about messaging them. Your soulmate looked almost startled. Then nodded. What should I say? The psychic smiled faintly. Do not say what you think will make them come back. Your soulmate listened. Say what is true. They looked down at the phone. Their fingers hovered over the screen. For several seconds, they did nothing. Then they opened your conversation. And that simple action brought another flood of memories. Your name. Your old messages. The last words exchanged. The spaces between conversations. Perhaps photographs. Perhaps voice notes. Perhaps moments that had once felt ordinary and now carried emotional weight. Your soulmate scrolled slowly. Then they stopped at one message from you. Something you had written long ago. Something they never fully understood at the time. The psychic watched their expression change. What did they say? The psychic asked. Your soulmate read the message silently. And suddenly everything went still. Because the message contained the exact clue they had missed. You had already told them what you needed. Not dramatically. Not as an ultimatum. You had said it gently. You may have written something like, I don't need everything figured out. I just need to know I'm not the only one trying to understand this. Your soulmate stared at those words. The psychic did not need to interpret them. The truth was right there. You had never demanded perfection. You had asked for participation. You had asked them to meet you emotionally. And somehow that had been the very thing they were too afraid to do. Your soulmate began typing. They wrote a sentence. Deleted it. Wrote another. Deleted that too. They almost typed, I miss you. But stopped. Too simple. Too much history lived beneath those 3 words. They typed, I'm sorry. Then stopped again. Important, but incomplete. They typed, I finally understand. Their fingers froze. That sentence felt closer. But understand what? They knew if they contacted you now, they could not hide behind vague language. So they began writing differently. Not trying to impress. Not trying to manipulate the outcome. Not trying to sound poetic. Just honest. They wrote about fear. About confusion. About the moments they pulled away. About how often they thought of you. About the realization that your silence was not indifference. About the psychic's question that forced them to confront whether they genuinely wanted your happiness. They wrote things they had never said out loud. And then they reached the sentence that terrified them most. I loved you while acting like I could afford to lose you. Your soulmate stopped typing. They stared at it. The truth of that sentence almost overwhelmed them. Because that was exactly what had happened. They loved you while assuming there would always be more time. They cared while behaving cautiously. They feared losing you while making choices that could create that exact outcome. And now they finally saw the contradiction. The psychic gently asked, "Are you going to send it?" Your soulmate looked at the screen. Then at the psychic. Then back at your name. Their thumb moved toward the send button. But before they pressed it, the psychic suddenly said, "Wait." Your soulmate froze. What? The psychic's expression had changed. The energy in the room became different. Not fearful. Not dark. Just unusually focused. There is one more thing you need to know before you send that message. Your soulmate lowered the phone. What is it? The psychic looked directly at them. You asked whether they were truly happy. Yes. And I told you they are becoming happier. Your soulmate nodded slowly. But there is a reason their energy changed so strongly very recently. Your soulmate's heart began pounding. How recently? The psychic paused. Very. Your soulmate gripped the phone. What happened? The psychic closed their eyes for a moment, then opened them again. It feels like they made a decision. Your soulmate's face went pale. What decision? The answer did not come immediately. Your soulmate repeated the question. What decision did they make? The psychic took a slow breath. And then came the words that made your soulmate forget about the message waiting unsent on the screen. They decided they would no longer keep one door open forever. Your soulmate stared at them. What door? The psychic's eyes softened. You already know. Your soulmate's breathing became uneven. They looked down at your name on the phone. Suddenly the urgency became real. Not because some magical deadline had appeared. Because for the first time, your soulmate understood that your life had continued moving even while they remained undecided. And then the psychic revealed something else. There is another person around their energy. Your soulmate looked up instantly. Their entire expression changed. Another person? The psychic nodded carefully. But do not jump to conclusions. Who? I cannot tell you that yet. Are they in love with someone else? The psychic paused. And that pause felt endless. Then the answer came. Not exactly. Your soulmate leaned forward. What does that mean? The psychic looked back toward the phone still resting in their hand. It means someone has recently been showing them something you struggled to give consistently. Your soulmate's eyes widened. What? The psychic answered in a low voice. Clarity. And in that single word, everything changed again. Because now your soulmate was no longer simply wondering whether you were happy. They were about to learn who had entered your emotional world, what this person had done differently, and why the decision you had recently made might force your soulmate to confront the one truth they had spent all this time avoiding.